The New Mexico Territory, 1881. Dusk was a prayer whispered across the Badlands, a final fervent plea before the crushing dark. The sun bled out along the western rim of the world, staining the high, thin clouds in shades of rust and violet. It was a beautiful death, a spectacle of celestial violence that left the land below in a state of bruised and weary grace. Down on the cracked, thirsty earth, Raphael sat with his back against a sentinel of weathered rock, the heat of the day still bleeding from its stone heart into his tired bones. The world around him was a masterpiece of desolation. The wind, a lonely sculptor, had carved the mesas into silent, brooding giants and swept the valley floor clean, leaving only skeletal sagebrush and the hard-packed alkali soil. It was a land that tolerated life, but did not welcome it, a place that scoured a man down to his essential parts, his grit, his grief, his will to endure. For 5 years, this had been Raphael's sanctuary and his prison. He had learned its language, the skittering of a lizard over hot stone, the mournful cry of a hawk circling on a thermal, the profound, unnerving silence of the night. He had become a part of it, his skin tanned to the color of worn leather, his eyes narrowed against the perpetual glare, holding the same distant, unreadable quality as the horizon itself. Men had started calling him the Ghost Rider, a name whispered in saloons and around campfires. They said he was more spirit than man, a specter of vengeance who rode the pale horses of the moonlight. He never corrected them. The legend was a useful shield, a cloak of fear that kept the curious and the foolish at a distance. It allowed him to move through the world untouched, a phantom haunted by a single, all-consuming purpose. In his calloused palm he cradled a small, tarnished silver locket. It was smooth and cool against his skin, its weight a familiar anchor in the shifting sands of his life. With his thumb, he traced the single name engraved on its surface, the letters worn soft by years of restless touch. Leo. He didn't need to open it. The image inside was burned onto the back of his eyes, more vivid than the landscape before him. Leo, his younger brother, frozen in time at 17. A boy with a reckless grin too wide for his face and eyes that held a dreamer's naive fire. Eyes that had looked at Raphael with unshakable hero worship. Eyes that had been wide with terror and confusion in their final flickering moments. The memory rose unbidden, as it always did in the quiet hours. The dusty street of a forgotten town, the sharp, panicked crack of gunfire, the metallic scent of blood so much thicker than the dust. He saw Leo stumbling from the bank, his shirt a blossoming flower of crimson, his face a mask of disbelief. Raphael had been there, meant to be watching his back, the responsible older brother. But he had been distracted, slow-caught, flat-footed by the chaos. He had failed. That single catastrophic failure had become the furnace in which his new life was forged, burning away everything he had once been, a ranch hand with simple dreams, and leaving only the hardened, vengeful steel of the Ghost Rider. Guilt was a constant companion, a shadow that clung to him even under the midday sun. It was the grit in his food, the chill in his bones on a warm night. It was the voice that whispered to him in the wind, telling him he had let his brother die for nothing more than a few sacks of bank money. But there was another name that fueled his fire, a name that gave his guilt a direction and his rage a target: Silas Kane. Kane, the leader of the gang, a man with a serpent's charm and a wolf's heart. He had orchestrated the robbery, fired the first shot, and walked away unscathed while Leo bled out in the street. For 5 years, Raphael had hunted him, following a cold trail of rumors and bodies across 3 territories. The hunt had cost him everything, but it had also given him the only thing he had left a reason to draw breath each morning. A faint, dark plume against the bruised twilight sky pulled him from his reverie. Smoke. He rose, his movements fluid and economical, a predator sensing a change in the wind. From his vantage point on the ridge, he could see the small, struggling settlement nestled in a shallow basin miles away. redemption. The name was a bitter irony, a cruel joke played on the desperate souls who had chosen to make their stand here. He'd been watching the town for a week, circling it like a hawk. His instincts, honed by years in the wilderness, told him Cain was close. An outlaw gang of Cain's size needed supplies, a place to rest and fester. A town like Redemption, with its aging sheriff and its air of weary resignation, was the perfect hunting ground. Through his spyglass, the town resolved into a collection of tired, sun-bleached wooden buildings lining a single wide dirt street. There was a general store, a saloon, whose batwing doors seemed to sigh with every swing, a blacksmith's forge, and a small whitewashed church with a leaning steeple. It was a town built on hope and slowly being ground down by reality. He saw the people's small figures moving with the slow, deliberate pace of those who have learned to conserve their energy against an unforgiving world. He focused the lens on the schoolhouse at the edge of town. A light glowed warmly in its window. He had learned her name was Sarah. He had seen her with the children, herding them with a gentle but firm patience. He'd seen the way she stood tall against the perpetual dust, her expression one of quiet determination. She represented everything this land tried to kill: growth, knowledge, hope. He had also seen something else. 2 days ago, he'd watched from this very ridge as 2 of Cain's men met with someone just outside of town. A furtive exchange in a dry wash. And Sarah, out walking, had seen it too. He saw her freeze, then quickly turn back, her posture stiff with the knowledge of what she had witnessed. She was a loose thread in Cain's carefully woven tapestry of fear. His attention was pulled back to the smoke. It wasn't the gentle white smoke of a cooking fire. This was a thick, greasy black column boiling into the sky with an ugly urgency. It was the smoke of something burning that was never meant to burn. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He had waited, biding his time, planning his approach. He wanted Cain isolated, away from innocence. But Cain was a man who thrived on chaos. He never played by the rules. Suddenly, the distant calm of the town shattered. The faint pop, pop, pop of gunfire echoed across the plains, a sound as sharp and final as a snapping bone. Raphael didn't need the spyglass anymore. He saw them, a dozen riders storming down the main street of Redemption. They weren't raiding or robbing. Their movements were too precise, too focused. They rode like a conquering army, their target clear. They converged on the schoolhouse. The warm light in the window was extinguished. A moment later, the front door was kicked from its hinges. Raphael's grip on the spyglass tightened until his knuckles were white. He saw a struggle figure silhouetted against the dark doorway. Then they emerged, dragging a lone figure with them: Sarah. Her resistance was fierce but futile against the brute strength of her captors. They threw her across the front of a saddle like a sack of grain, her white dress a stark beacon in the gathering gloom. The riders wheeled their horses around, firing parting shots into the air, and the buildings a final act of contempt for the helpless town. The townsfolk who had scattered for cover now watched in stunned silence as the gang thundered out of Redemption, leaving behind the burning scent of gunpowder and the smoldering ruin of their peace. Raphael lowered his spyglass, his face a mask of cold fury. This changed everything. His private 5-year war had just become a public spectacle. Cain had not just taken a hostage. He had taken the one piece of redemption that still represented a future. He had crossed a line, turning Raphael's personal vendetta into a desperate race against time. The ghost of his brother cried out for vengeance, but the sight of the terrified woman and the violated town sparked something else within him, a flicker of the man he used to be, the man who protected, not just avenged. He slid the silver locket back into his shirt pocket, the cool metal a familiar weight against his heart. He swung himself into the saddle of his horse, a lean, muscular buckskin that moved with the same restless energy as its rider. He looked toward the disappearing cloud of dust on the horizon, the direction of Cain's gang. Then he looked back at the wounded town of Redemption. His choice was made. The hunt was no longer a patient, solitary affair. It was now a rescue. He spurred his horse not towards Cain, but towards the town. He would not make the same mistake twice. He would not be too late again. The Ghost Rider was about to ride into Redemption, and he was bringing hell with him. The sun had fully set, and the desert was awash in the pale, ethereal glow of a rising moon. The land once bleached by the sun was now painted in silver and shadow, a world of stark and dangerous beauty. The red sand glowed like dying embers, and the looming shadows of the mesas stretched long and skeletal, like the fingers of silent stone giants reaching across the valley. The wind picked up a mournful sigh that whispered through the canyons and carried the scent of distant rain and present sorrow. Raphael rode into Redemption as if he were part of this spectral landscape, his buckskin's hooves making little sound on the packed earth of the main street. The town was paralyzed, caught in the awful silence that follows violence. Doors remained shut, windows dark. The only light came from the saloon, a jaundiced yellow rectangle spilled across the dust and the flickering orange flames of the small fire the gang had set at the livery, now being doused with frantic buckets of water by a few brave men. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, the word "Sheriff" painted in faded letters above a door that hung slightly askew. He tied his horse to the hitching post, his movements deliberate, his presence drawing nervous glances from the shadows. The townspeople saw the war paint on his face, stark black lines that followed the contours of his cheekbones, a symbol of his singular purpose, and the twin Colt peacemakers holstered low on his hips. They saw a man who was not a savior, but an omen. The door to the office creaked open. A man stepped out, his body framed by the lamplight from within. He was older, his shoulders stooped with the weight of years and the burden of his badge. His face was a roadmap of past troubles, his eyes a weary gray. This was Sheriff Elias Vance. He held a Winchester rifle, but it rested in the crook of his arm with a tired familiarity rather than immediate threat. "Can I help you, stranger?" Vance's voice was gravelly like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. The woman they took, Raphael, said, his own voice a low rasp, unused to conversation. "The schoolteacher. Her name is Sarah." It wasn't a question. Vance's eyes narrowed, taking in Raphael's appearance. "You know her." "I know who took her. Silas Cain." The sheriff's weariness was momentarily replaced by a flicker of sharp attention. "You know Cain's business. Then you know this town has nothing to offer a man like that. We're just dirt and desperation." "Why her?" "She saw something," Raphael stated simply. "A deal his men were making. She became a liability." Vance sighed, the sound heavy with resignation. He leaned the rifle against the doorframe. "So this ain't a raid. It's a message. To anyone who thinks of crossing him." He looked up and down the empty street. Message received. A stout man in a pristine suit, his face pale and sweating, despite the cooling air, scurried out from the shadows of the general store. He wrung his hands, his eyes darting from the sheriff to Raphael. "Sheriff, what are we to do? This is an outrage our town violated, and Miss Sarah, that poor girl." This was Mr. Abernathy, the town banker, a man whose soft hands and clean clothes set him apart from the rest of Redemption's weathered populace. "We'll form a posse," Mr. Abernathy Vance said, his tone lacking conviction. "Come sunrise." "Sunrise." Abernathy scoffed, his voice thin and reedy. "By sunrise, they'll be halfway to Mexico. We must act now, this rider." He gestured a trembling finger at Raphael. "He seems capable. Perhaps he could be persuaded to assist us. For a price, of course." Raphael's gaze settled on the banker, a cold, flat stare that made Abernathy take an involuntary step back. "This isn't about money. His attention returned to the sheriff. A posse of shopkeepers and farmers won't catch Kane. They'll just get themselves killed. He's in the Badlands in the canyons. You need someone who knows that terrain, someone who knows him. And I take it that someone is you, Vance asked, his skepticism plain. Why, what's your stake in this? You don't look like the type to play the hero. Raphael's hand went unconsciously to his chest, to the locket hidden beneath his shirt. My stake is with Kane. It's personal. He left the declaration hanging in the air, offering no further explanation. The sheriff studied him for a long moment, his gaze sharp and appraising. He saw the grief haunting the stranger's eyes and the brutal singularity of his focus. This wasn't a man looking for a reward. He was a man looking for a reckoning. All right, Vance said, finally nodding slowly. The trail will be fresh, but you'll be one man against a dozen. It's better odds than they'll have, Raphael replied. He turned to leave, but Vance's voice stopped him. Stranger, about Kane. There was a bank job 5 years back, over in Cedar Flats. A young fellow was killed. Kane's gang was responsible, but the official report, it never sat right with me. Details were missing. Felt like folks in charge were in a hurry to close the book on it. Raphael froze his back to the sheriff. The casual mention of the event struck him like a physical blow. He had spent 5 years running from the pity and questions, yet here, in this forgotten town, the ghost of that day had found him. What about it? Raphael asked, his voice tight. Just that Kane is more than a common thug. Vance continued, oblivious to the wound he had just probed. He's clever, and the company he keeps is sometimes unexpected. You be careful who you trust. Out here, snakes don't always rattle before they strike. Raphael gave a curt nod, not trusting himself to speak. He swung back into his saddle, the leather creaking in the quiet street. He looked once more at the faces in the shadows, scared, helpless, looking to him for a miracle he had no intention of providing. He wasn't here for them. He was here for Kane. Sarah's rescue was just a means to an end. He nudged his horse forward, leaving the town and its fear behind him, and rode out into the vast, silvered darkness of the Badlands. The hunt had begun. Sarah's world had been reduced to the rhythmic, jarring gait of the horse, the rough texture of the saddlebag against her cheek, and the smell of sweat, leather, and unwashed man. Her hands were bound tightly in front of her, the rope biting into her wrists. The man holding her, a brute with a grimy beard and breath that smelled of stale whiskey, grunted with every stride, his arm a steel band across her waist. She refused to cry. She refused to scream. Fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but she forced it down, smothering it with a defiant anger. She was not a helpless lamb to be led to slaughter. She was a survivor forged in the harsh realities of a life that had taken her parents and left her with nothing but her own resilience. She focused on the world around her, memorizing the details, searching for a chance, however slim. The moon was nearly full, illuminating the alien landscape of rock spires and deep shadows. They were moving into the labyrinthine canyons she had only ever seen from a distance, a place the townsfolk called the Devil's Jaw. She noted the turns they took, the shape of the rock formations, anything that could serve as a landmark. The leader, Silas Kane, rode at the head of the group. Unlike his men who were coarse and brutish, Kane moved with a chilling grace. He sat his horse with an easy confidence, his clothes dark but well kept. When he turned to look back at them, the moonlight caught the sharp intelligence in his eyes. He wasn't a simple bandit. He was something far more dangerous. Comfortable back there. Miss Miller Kane's voice was smooth-laced with a mocking politeness that was more menacing than any threat. I've had more pleasant journeys, Sarah replied, her own voice steady, betraying none of her terror. A low chuckle ran through the gang. Kane smiled, a predatory flash of white in the dark. Spirit. I admire that. It's a shame when it has to be broken. He gestured to the vast, empty wilderness around them. Don't entertain any thoughts of escape. Out here, the land itself is your prison. There is no water, no shelter. We are your only hope of seeing another sunrise. He was trying to intimidate her, to crush her will. She met his gaze unflinching. And what do you want with me? Redemption has no money. We have nothing of value. Oh, but you do, my dear Cain said, his smile widening. You have a very valuable commodity, your silence. You were careless. You saw something you were not meant to see. A private business transaction. And in my line of work, witnesses are a liability that must be managed. The man holding her grunted. Why not just put a bullet in her and be done with it, boss? Patience, Jasper Cain chided gently. She may yet have her uses. A school teacher. So respectable. She makes for excellent leverage. And besides, his eyes found hers again, a cold fire in them. I have a feeling a certain ghost is on his way. And I'd like to have a proper welcome prepared for him. The name meant nothing to Sarah, but the way Cain said it with a mix of anticipation and venom sent a shiver down her spine. They were using her as bait. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her resolve hardened. If she was bait, then she was not powerless. The game was not over yet. She would watch and she would wait. And when the moment came, she would be ready. Raphael followed the trail with an almost supernatural focus. The tracks of a dozen shod horses were a blazed path in the moonlight. But he looked for more. A broken branch. A displaced stone. The subtle signs that told him how fast they were moving, whether they were on alert. He moved through the canyons, not as a pursuer, but as a part of the night, his buckskin stepping surely over the rocky terrain, its coat the color of the moon-dusted stone. He was in his element here. The badlands which terrified lesser men were his home. He knew the hidden springs and the game trails that served as secret pathways through the maze of rock. Cain was confident in this terrain, but Raphael was born of it. As he rode, his thoughts drifted, pulled back by Sheriff Vance's words. The official report. It never sat right with me. He pushed the thought away. It didn't matter. The past was a closed book sealed with his brother's blood. All that mattered was the present. All that mattered was Cain. Yet a memory flickered at the edge of his consciousness. A month before the robbery, he remembered an argument with Leo. His brother had been flashing a roll of money-new clothes, a silver-plated pocket watch. Where'd you get all this? Leo, Raphael had asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Just came into a bit of luck, that's all Leo had said, his grin a little too bright, his eyes avoiding Raphael's. Don't you worry about me, Raph. I'm gonna make us rich. We'll have our own ranch bigger than the one Pa lost. Luck doesn't buy a watch like that, Raphael had pressed. Who are you mixed up with? Leo's good humor had evaporated, replaced by a flash of anger. You're not my father. Stop treating me like a kid. I can handle myself. The memory was sharp, painful. At the time, Raphael had dismissed it as youthful arrogance. Now viewed through the lens of Vance's doubt, it felt different. It felt like a clue he had failed to see. What kind of luck had Leo come into who had given him that money? He shook his head, forcing the thoughts from his mind. It was a distraction. Cain was the target. The rest was just noise. He found their first camp an hour after midnight. A small fire was reduced to glowing embers in a sheltered cove. They had been careless, leaving behind scraps of food and an empty whiskey bottle. They thought they were safe deep in their own territory. They were wrong. Raphael dismounted, examining the scene. They had rested for less than an hour. They were pushing hard. He found something else half buried in the sand near the fire. A small blue ribbon, the kind a woman might wear in her hair. Sarah. She was fighting, leaving a trail. It was a small act of defiance, a spark of hope in the darkness. He picked it up, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle, and tucked it into his pocket. It wasn't just about Leo anymore. It was about her too. He owed her a sunrise. He pressed on the ribbon, a small tangible reminder of the life that hung in the balance. He pushed his horse harder, the urgency of fire in his veins. The moon climbed higher, a cold, silent witness in the vast, empty sky, and the ghost rider melted back into the shadows, a relentless phantom closing the distance. The trail led deeper into the Devil's Jaw, the canyon walls rising on either side like colossal rotting teeth. The air grew cooler, carrying the damp mineral scent of deep earth. Raphael knew this area. It was a network of dead ends, box canyons, and abandoned prospector mines. A perfect place for an outlaw lair. Easy to defend, impossible to approach without being seen. He left his horse tethered in a narrow arroyo, feeding it a handful of oats and a sip of water from his canteen. The final approach had to be on foot. He moved with the silence of an Apache, his worn boots making no sound on the gravelly ground. He climbed the scree slope of a ridge, his body low, using the jagged rocks and twisted junipers for cover. From the top, he had a clear view of the canyon floor below. There it was. A cave mouth partially hidden by a rock slide served as the entrance to an old played-out silver mine. A single guard stood near the entrance, a rifle cradled in his arms, his silhouette stark against the glow of a fire from within the cave. The horses were corralled in a makeshift pen nearby. Cain's hideout. He settled in to watch his patience, a weapon he had sharpened over 5 long years. He needed to understand their numbers, their routines, the layout of the camp. A frontal assault would be suicide. This required precision. From inside the cave, he heard the rough laughter of men and the clink of bottles. He saw Sarah. They had tied her to a wooden support beam just inside the cave mouth, away from the main group but clearly visible. She sat straight backed, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes wide and watchful in the firelight. Even in captivity, she possessed a quiet dignity that infuriated her captors. One of them, the brute named Jasper, walked over and offered her a swig from his bottle. She turned her head away in disgust. He laughed a cruel, ugly sound and poured some of the liquor onto the ground in front of her. Raphael felt a cold, controlled rage build within him. These men were animals, and Cain was their alpha. He watched as Cain himself emerged from the deeper recesses of the mine. He was holding a worn leather ledger. He sat by the fire, flipping through its pages, a look of intense concentration on his face. This was unexpected. What was a man like Cain doing with a ledger? Raphael wished he had his spyglass. He watched Cain for a long time, his instincts screaming that the book was important. It was out of place. It was a clue. His gaze shifted back to the guard. The man was growing complacent, his attention drifting. This was his chance. Raphael began his descent, moving from shadow to shadow, a ghost in the moonlight. He was a stone's throw from the camp when a pebble dislodged by his boot skittered down the slope. It was a small sound, almost lost in the whisper of the wind, but the guard heard it. "Who's there?" The guard called out, his rifle snapping up to his shoulder. The camp fell silent. The laughter died. Men reached for their guns. Raphael froze behind a rock, cursing his mistake. Cain rose slowly from the fire, the ledger still in his hand. He peered into the darkness, a slight knowing smile on his lips. "It seems our guest of honor has arrived." "No need to be shy, Raphael. Come into the light. We have so much to discuss." The game of cat and mouse was over. Raphael drew his peacemakers, the oiled click of the hammers cocking, sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden tense silence. He was exposed. He had one option left: unleash the storm. He rose from behind the rock, a fearsome silhouette against the moonlit ridge, and opened fire. The night erupted in a symphony of chaos. Raphael's first shot took the guard in the chest, sending him sprawling backward. His second extinguished the lantern hanging at the cave entrance, plunging the immediate area into a confusing mix of moonlight and firelight. Cain's men scrambled for cover, returning fire wildly into the darkness where Raphael had been. But Raphael was no longer there. He was a wraith moving along the ridge, using the chaos he had created. He fired again, his shots precise, aimed not to kill, but to control. He hit a stack of crates, sending them tumbling and creating a new barrier. He shot a whiskey bottle out of a man's hand, and the shattering glass and yelp of surprise adding to the confusion. He was orchestrating the battle, turning their numbers against them. Spread out, find him. Cain's voice cut through the din, calm and authoritative. He's just one man. Raphael used the distraction to slide down a steep dirt embankment, landing silently in the shadows near the horse corral. He pulled his knife and with 2 quick slashes cut the rope gate. He slapped the rump of the nearest horse, sending it, and the rest of the panicked herd stampeding through the camp. Men yelled and dove out of the way as hooves thundered past, adding another layer of pandemonium. In the midst of the chaos, Raphael slipped towards the cave mouth. His target was Sarah. He saw her struggling against her bonds, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fierce hope. Jasper, the brute who had taunted her, was making a move for her, intending to use her as a human shield. Raphael was faster. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, his movements a blur. He brought the butt of his pistol down hard on the back of Jasper's head. The man crumpled to the ground without a sound. With his knife, Raphael sliced through the ropes binding Sarah's wrists. "Come on," he grunted, pulling her to her feet. "Stay behind me." She didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet from near the fire, holding it like a weapon. Her eyes met his for a brief second, and in them, he saw not a grateful victim, but an ally. "To the west, there's a narrow pass," she whispered, her voice urgent. "I saw it when they brought me in." Gunfire erupted from the mouth of the mine. Cain and the remainder of his men were regrouping. "There's no time," Raphael yelled, pushing her behind a large boulder. "They'll cut us down in the open." He looked around, his mind racing. Their only chance was to go where Cain wouldn't expect. He pointed towards the dark, gaping maw of the abandoned mine. "In there." "We go deeper." Sarah's eyes widened in fear. The mine looked like a tomb. "We'll be trapped." "We're already trapped," he countered, his voice grim. He fired 2 shots back into the mine to keep their heads down. "It's our only chance." "Go?" He gave her a final push, and she scrambled into the darkness. Raphael laid down, suppressing fire, forcing Cain's men back, then followed her, disappearing from the firelight, into the oppressive subterranean black. The sounds of gunfire faded, replaced by the dripping of water and the heavy, suffocating silence of the deep earth. They were alive, but they had just traded one prison for another. The darkness inside the mine was absolute, a thick, palpable blackness that swallowed the light and deadened the sound. It was cold, the kind of ancient damp chill that seeps into your bones, and the air was heavy with the smell of wet rock and decay. Water dripped from the ceiling in a slow, maddening rhythm, each drop echoing in the profound silence. Raphael grabbed Sarah's arm, his touch firm but not rough. "Stay close, don't make a sound." He pulled a small tin from his pocket. Inside were matches and a stub of a candle. He struck a match against the rock wall. The sudden flare of light was blinding, throwing their shadows long and distorted against the rough-hewn tunnel. He lit the candle, its small flickering flame, a fragile shield against the immense darkness. They were in the main shaft. Rotting wooden beams, slick with moisture, strained to hold back the crushing weight of the earth above. The tunnel stretched forward into impenetrable gloom. Side shafts branched off at odd angles, dark mouths that promised only confusion and dead ends. "He'll follow us," Sarah whispered, her voice tight with tension. The skillet she still clutched seemed a pitiful defense against the unseen dangers. "I know," Raphael said. He held the candle aloft, his eyes scanning their surroundings. "He thinks he has us cornered. We'll use that." He saw a pile of discarded mining tools in a corner, a rusted pickaxe, a shovel, a coil of thick rope. An idea began to form. From the mine entrance, they heard Cain's voice amplified by the tunnel's acoustics. "Raphael, There is nowhere to run. You are in my world now. This mountain is my fortress, and you have willingly walked into its dungeon." Raphael ignored the taunt. He handed the candle to Sarah. "Hold this. Keep it steady." He picked up the heavy pickaxe, testing its weight. He began to move along the tunnel, tapping the support beams with the axe handle, listening to the sound each one made. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked. Looking for a weakness, he replied without turning. Most of the beams gave a solid, reassuring thud. But then he struck one that answered with a dull, hollow groan. A fine trickle of dust sifted down from the ceiling above it. The beam was rotten, barely holding. "Here." He looked down a side tunnel just beyond the weak support. It seemed to slope downward. "We go this way. When they come, I'll bring this section down behind us. It will buy us time." "It could bring the whole mine down on top of us," she protested. "It's a risk we have to take." His tone was final. They heard footsteps approaching the entrance, slow and cautious. Cain was coming. "Go now," Raphael urged. He gave her a gentle push toward the side tunnel. "I'll be right behind you." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then squeezed his arm. "Be careful." She turned and disappeared into the darkness of the smaller shaft, the candlelight shrinking until it was just a pinprick. Raphael stood alone in the main tunnel, the pickaxe held ready. He could see the silhouettes of two of Cain's men as they crept into the mine, their lanterns casting dancing, grotesque shadows. They were the point men, the disposable ones. Cain would be behind them. Raphael waited in the shadows, his breathing slow and even. He let the first two men pass his position. He needed Cain himself to be in the trap. Then he saw him. Silas Cain stepped into the mine, moving with an arrogant confidence, a lantern held high, in one hand a pistol in the other. "Come out, Ghost Rider Cain," called his voice, echoing. "Let us end this man to man." That was the signal. Raphael swung the pickaxe with all his strength, the sharp point biting deep into the rotten support beam. The wood splintered with a sound like a gunshot. A deep, terrifying groan reverberated through the earth as the ceiling above began to shift. "It's a trap," one of Cain's men screamed. Raphael didn't wait to see the result. He dove into the side tunnel just as the world behind him collapsed. A deafening roar filled the mine as tons of rock and earth cascaded down, shaking the very foundations of the mountain. The air filled with a choking cloud of dust that instantly extinguished his pursuers' lanterns. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, away from the collapse, the thunderous noise chasing him down the tunnel. He caught up to Sarah, who was pressed against the wall, her face pale with terror in the wavering candlelight. The ground trembled beneath them. And then, as quickly as it began, the collapse subsided, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of settling dust and a few falling pebbles. They were sealed in, alive but trapped. "Did you?" she began. "I got them." Raphael said, his voice grim, or at least blocked them. He took the candle from her trembling hand and led the way deeper into the winding shaft. The air was thin and stale. For what felt like an eternity, they walked in silence, the narrow tunnel twisting and turning. Hope began to fade, replaced by the suffocating fear that they had merely chosen a slower, darker death. And then they saw it, a faint pale light ahead. Not the yellow of a lantern, but the soft gray light of the outside world. An air shaft, a small vertical chimney leading up to the surface used for ventilation by the miners decades ago. It was their only way out. When they reached the bottom of the shaft, they looked up. It was a straight 20-foot climb up a crumbling rock face. Faint moonlight filtered down from the opening above. "I can't climb that," Sarah said, her voice filled with despair. Raphael looked back the way they had come. He didn't know how long the rockfall would hold Cain back. He looked at the rope he had grabbed. It was old, but it might hold. "I can." He fashioned a loop in one end of the rope, and after a few tries managed to snag it on a jutting piece of rock near the top of the shaft. He tested it, pulling with all his weight. It held. "I'll go up first," he said. "Then I'll pull you up." He began to climb his boots, finding small holds in the rock face, his arms straining as he pulled himself up the coarse rope. He was halfway up when he heard a noise from the tunnel behind them. A scraping sound. The sound of someone digging through the rock fall. "Cain, he's coming," Sarah cried out, her voice echoing up the shaft. Raphael climbed faster, his muscles burning. He ignored the pain, focusing only on the patch of starry sky above. He reached the top, his hands raw and bleeding, and hauled himself over the edge onto a narrow, windswept ledge. He was out. He immediately turned and began pulling on the rope. Sarah grabbed on. Below, Sarah tied the end of the rope around her waist and grabbed on with both hands. Pull. Raphael leaned back, his boots digging into the loose shale for purchase, and pulled with all his might. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to rise up the shaft. She was halfway up when Silas Cain appeared at the bottom, his face a demonic mask of fury in the light of his lantern. He had clawed his way through the rubble. "You are not getting away," he roared, raising his pistol. Raphael pulled harder, desperation giving him a surge of strength. The first shot from Cain's gun ricocheted off the rock wall, showering Sarah with stone fragments. The second shot was truer. It struck the rope just above her head, the old hemp-frayed strands snapping one by one. "It's not going to hold," she screamed. Raphael gave a last, desperate heave. Sarah's hands cleared the ledge just as the rope snapped. She tumbled onto the rock beside him, safe. Below, Cain let out a cry of pure, frustrated rage. They didn't wait. Raphael grabbed her hand, and they scrambled away from the air shaft, disappearing into the maze of rocks on the mountaintop. Just as a powerful dust storm began to blow in from the west, the wind howling like a vengeful spirit promising to erase their tracks and cover their escape. They had survived the mine, but the confrontation with Cain was far from over. It had only been postponed. While they were trapped, Raphael had found something near the collapsed tunnel. Cain, in his haste, had dropped the leather ledger. Raphael had snatched it up. Now, under the relative safety of a rocky overhang, as the dust storm raged around them, he opened it by the light of his last candle. The pages were filled with neat columns of names, dates, and figures. It wasn't a business ledger. It was a record of blackmail. Names of powerful men in the territory: judges, land barons, politicians. Next to each name were details of their crimes and the amounts they had paid to Cain for his silence. This was the source of his power. Not just robbery, but information. Then he saw it. A section at the back detailing a land-grabbing scheme centered around redemption. It described how water rights were being secretly bought up and rerouted, how deeds were being forged, all to bankrupt the local ranchers and force them to sell their land for pennies on the dollar. And the architect of the entire scheme, the man paying Cain for his services, was a name Raphael recognized with a sickening jolt: Mr. Abernathy, the banker. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The bank robbery in Cedar Flats 5 years ago. It hadn't been a random act of greed. It was a message, a demonstration of power on Abernathy's behalf. And Sheriff Vance's words came back to him. The details were missing. Unexpected company. His blood ran cold as he found the final entry in that section. It was a payment record dated 1 week before the robbery. The entry read, "Final payment to LM for services rendered. Liason, an inside man." LM. Leo's full name was Leo Michael. His brother. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The wind howled outside, a perfect mirror of the storm in his soul. Leo, an accomplice. A willing participant in Abernathy's corrupt scheme. It couldn't be true. His brother was a victim, an innocent boy caught in the crossfire. His entire 5-year quest, the very foundation of his identity as the Ghost Rider, was built on that single, unshakable belief. He slammed the ledger shut. It was a lie. A trick by Cain to poison his mind. But deep down, the memory of Leo with his unexplained money and his secretiveness festered like an old wound. He had to know the truth. And there was only one person left who could give it to him. The storm provided the perfect cover. Under the cloak of the howling wind and swirling dust, they made their way down the mountain and back to where Raphael had left his horse. The journey back to redemption was a blur. Raphael was a man possessed his mind, a maelstrom of confusion, betrayal, and a grief so profound it threatened to shatter him. Sarah rode behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist, sensing the darkness that had enveloped him, but saying nothing. They arrived in redemption just before dawn. The storm had passed, leaving the air washed clean, and the sky a soft bruised purple. The town was still asleep, unaware of the drama that had unfolded in the mountains. Raphael went straight to the sheriff's office. He pounded on the door, the sound like a hammer blow in the quiet street. Vance opened the door, his eyes widening in surprise at the sight of Raphael and Sarah, both covered in dust and exhaustion. "Miss Miller, you're safe," he exclaimed. "There's no time," Raphael said, his voice raw. He threw the ledger onto the sheriff's desk. "It's all in there. Abernathy. He's been bleeding this town dry. He hired Cain." Vance's weary eyes scanned the pages, his expression hardening from disbelief to grim certainty. "I'll be damned. The snake was right here in our nest the whole time." He looked up at Raphael. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to get the truth," Raphael said. He turned and walked out, his destination clear. He was going to the bank. He was going to confront Abernathy. But as he crossed the street, a voice called out from the shadows of an alley, "Not so fast, Raphael." Silas Cain stepped out, his clothes torn, his face scratched and bruised, but his eyes burning with an unholy fire. He held his pistol aimed not at Raphael, but at Sarah, who had followed him out of the sheriff's office. Two of his remaining men emerged behind him. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" Cain sneered. "I followed the storm. It led me right back to you." He gestured with his pistol. "The ledger. Give it to me." "It's over, Cain," Raphael said, his hand hovering over his own gun. "The sheriff knows. The whole territory will know by noon." Cain laughed, a chilling, humorless sound. "You still don't get it, do you? You still think this is about money and land. You think you're the hero in this story." His eyes bored into Raphael's. "You want the truth? You want to know what really happened to your precious little brother?" This was it. The moment of reckoning. The world seemed to shrink until it was only the space between the two men. "Leo wasn't some innocent boy," Cain said, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "He was Abernathy's pawn, just like me. He was the inside man at that bank. But he got scared. He was going to confess to expose the entire scheme. Abernathy wanted him silenced. He paid me to do it. But I did it for my own reasons." Cain took a step forward, his eyes blazing. "Before Abernathy ruined your lives, he ruined mine. My father was a rancher right here in this valley. Abernathy's schemes took everything from him, left him with nothing. He died a broken man. So when Abernathy came to me, I saw my chance. A chance to get my revenge piece by piece. Killing Leo. That wasn't just a job. It was a pleasure. A way to hurt Abernathy's operation, to make him sweat. And a way to create you." He smiled, a terrible, triumphant grin. "I knew who you were. I knew what Leo's death would do to you. I watched you become the Ghost Rider, a perfect instrument of vengeance. I led you here to redemption, knowing you would tear Abernathy's world apart for me. My own personal phantom. You've done my work for me, Raphael. You've been my puppet all along." The words struck Raphael with the force of a physical blow. The truth, in all its devastating ugliness, washed over him. His grief, his rage, his 5 years of vengeance, it had all been a lie, a carefully orchestrated manipulation. He hadn't been hunting a monster. He had been a tool in that monster's own quest for revenge. The ghost that had haunted him wasn't his brother's. It was his own. The dust storm had been a prelude. The real storm was here now, in the heart of redemption, with the rising sun as its witness. It was time for the final confrontation, not in a dark mine, but in the open street for all to see. The climax was not just about saving Sarah or defeating Cain. It was about Raphael confronting the shattered ruins of his past and deciding what man he would be in the few seconds he had left. The world had gone silent. The rising sun cast long dramatic shadows down the main street of redemption. There was only the space between the men charged with 5 years of hatred lies and manipulated grief. Cain's revelation hung in the air, a poisonous vapor that had stripped away every certainty Raphael had ever known. His entire existence as the Ghost Rider, a righteous avenger for his innocent brother, was a fiction. He was a pawn, a ghost created and directed by the very man he sought to destroy. "You've been chasing a memory," Raphael Cain taunted, his voice a low, cruel caress. "A story you told yourself to make the guilt bearable. But your brother wasn't a saint. He was weak. And in this world, the weak are currency for men like Abernathy. And for men like me." From the corner of his eye, Raphael saw movement. Sheriff Vance stepping out of his office, Winchester in hand. And Mr. Abernathy, drawn by the commotion, peering from the window of the bank, his face a mask of panicked fear. The whole town was waking up to the final act of a play they didn't know they were a part of. Raphael's mind was a maelstrom, but in the center of the storm, a strange calm began to settle. The rage was still there, a white-hot coal in his chest, but it was different now. It was no longer the blind, vengeful fury that had driven him for years. It was cold, clear and focused. The Ghost Rider, the phantom of his own making, began to recede, leaving just Raphael, a man who had been stripped of his illusions and forced to see the world as it truly was. He looked at Sarah, who stood frozen, Cain's pistol still aimed at her. He saw the defiance in her eyes, the same unbroken spirit he had seen in the cave. She was not a prop in this drama. She was a life, a future. And in that moment, something shifted in him. This was no longer about his past, about Leo, or even about Cain's twisted games. It was about her. It was about this town. It was about a future that was not defined by ghosts. "Let her go, Cain," Raphael said, his voice quiet, devoid of the theatrical anger he might have once used. It was the voice of a man who had nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing to fear. "And why would I do that?" Cain sneered. "She's my last card to play." "Because it's over," Raphael said. "Look around you. Abernathy is finished. Your revenge is complete. This is just habit." For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed Cain's face. He had won his war against Abernathy. Raphael had delivered the final blow just as planned. What was left? It was the opening Raphael needed. He wasn't looking at Cain. He was looking at the reflection in the general store window behind Cain. He could see one of Cain's men shifting his position, trying to get a clear shot at the sheriff. "Vance," Raphael yelled. Time seemed to dilate. Vance, understanding the warning, swung his Winchester and fired. The shot echoed like a thunderclap down the empty street. The man behind Cain cried out and crumpled to the ground. In that same split second of distraction, Sarah acted. She stomped down hard on Cain's instep with the heel of her boot. He grunted in pain, his aim wavering for a fraction of a second. It was all Raphael needed. He drew his Colt Peacemaker. The motion was not a blur of speed, but a single fluid and inevitable act. It was the culmination of 5 years of practice of living and breathing with the weight of the gun on his hip. His shot was not aimed at Cain's heart or head. It was aimed at his hand. Raphael's bullet struck Cain's pistol, sending it spinning from his grasp with a crack of splintering wood and metal. Cain stared at his numb, bleeding hand in disbelief. His other man, seeing the tables turned so completely, threw down his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. It was over. No dramatic final duel, just a sudden, shocking end. Cain looked at Raphael, his face a mixture of fury and a strange, hollow emptiness. His grand manipulative scheme had succeeded, but it had left him with nothing. He was a king with no kingdom, a victor with no prize. Raphael walked forward, his own pistol now aimed steadily at Cain's chest. He stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the final desperate flicker of defiance in the other man's eyes. This was the moment he had dreamed of for half a decade. The moment to pull the trigger and send his brother's killer to hell. But the face he saw was not just that of a murderer. It was the face of a man twisted by his own grief. A man who had become a monster to fight another one. He saw a reflection of himself, of the path he had almost followed to its bitter end. Killing him now would not be justice. It would be an echo of the same cycle of vengeance that had consumed them both. He lowered his gun. "It's done," Raphael said, his voice heavy. Sheriff Vance approached cautiously, his rifle trained on Cain. "Don't move a muscle, Silas." From the bank, Mr. Abernathy, seeing his hired protector defeated, made a panicked run for it out the back. But he didn't get far. Two ranchers, drawn by the gunshots, and now understanding the banker's treachery, intercepted him, their faces hard with the righteous anger of wronged men. The town of Redemption, which had been a victim for so long, was finally fighting back. Vance cuffed a stunned and silent Cain, then his surviving man. He looked at Raphael, a new respect in his weary eyes. "You could have killed him." "The Ghost Rider would have," Raphael replied softly. Raphael didn't. He turned and looked at Sarah. She was watching him, her expression one of understanding and a deep, quiet gratitude. He had not just saved her life. He had saved her town. And in doing so, he had begun to save himself. The immediate aftermath was a quiet flurry of activity. Sheriff Vance, reinvigorated with a purpose he hadn't felt in years, locked Cain and his man in the town's small jail cell. He took a sworn statement from Abernathy, who collapsed into a weeping, confessing mess the moment the cell door clanged shut. The ledger Raphael had recovered was an ironclad case. The story of the banker's corruption and Cain's twisted revenge spread through the town like wildfire, not as a rumor, but as a hard, liberating truth. Redemption, a town named in hope, finally had a chance to live up to its name. Raphael stood by the water trough, washing the grime and the last traces of his war paint from his face. The reflection that looked back at him from the water was that of a stranger, older, scarred, but his eyes were clear for the first time in 5 years. The ghost was gone. Sarah approached him, carrying a cup of coffee. She handed it to him, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you," she said simply. The words were not just for the rescue, but for the choice he had made in the street. The choice for justice, not vengeance. "I didn't do it for the town," he said, his voice still raspy but softer now. "Or for you. Not at first." "I know," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "But you did in the end. That's what matters." She paused. "What will you do now?" It was the question that echoed in the hollow space inside him. For 5 years, the hunt for Cain had been his entire world. Now it was over. He had no trail to follow, no purpose to drive him. He was adrift. "I don't know," he admitted, and the honesty of it was both terrifying and freeing. He stayed in Redemption for another day, watching as the town began to heal. He saw the townsfolk gathering in the street, not in fear, but in discussion, planning their future free from Abernathy's shadow. He saw Sarah in the schoolhouse, the door repaired, sweeping out the last of the dust, preparing to teach again. He saw hope, a fragile but resilient flower blooming in the harshest of soils. On the morning of the second day, he knew he had to leave. His place was not here among these people. But before he left, there was one last thing he had to do. He rode out to the small, dusty cemetery on the hill overlooking the town. He found the simple wooden marker weathered by 5 years of sun and wind. Leo Michael, beloved brother. He dismounted and knelt before the grave. He no longer saw the idealized innocent boy of his memory. He saw Leo as he truly was, a young man who was flawed, ambitious, and scared. A boy who made a terrible mistake not out of evil, but out of a desperate, misguided desire for a better life. He was not a saint to be avenged, but a brother to be mourned. Raphael pulled the tarnished silver locket from his shirt. He opened it, looking at the smiling face within one last time. For 5 years, this object had been his anchor, his obsession, the physical manifestation of his guilt and his vow of vengeance. It had kept his brother's memory alive, but it had also kept him chained to the past, a prisoner of his own making. He closed the locket with a soft click. With his bare hands, he dug a small hole in the earth at the foot of the grave marker. He placed the locket inside, feeling its cool weight for the last time. This was not an act of forgetting, but of letting go. He was burying the ghost. He was burying his guilt. He was forgiving his brother, and in doing so, he was finally forgiving himself. He covered the locket with dirt, his hands packing the earth down firmly. He stood his shoulders feeling lighter than they had in years. The wind whispered through the tall grass, and for the first time, it didn't sound like a lament. It sounded like a promise. He turned from the grave and walked back to his horse. He looked down at the town of redemption, at the smoke rising peacefully from its chimneys, at the small figures moving with a newfound purpose. He had ridden in as a specter of death, a ghost haunted by the past. But he would not ride off into the sunset as a lone mythic figure. His path did not lead away into the empty wilderness. He swung into the saddle and turned his horse not west into the setting sun, but back down the hill toward the town. He didn't know what his future held. He didn't know if he would stay a day or a lifetime. But he knew he was no longer running. He was Raphael again, a man ready to find his own redemption, not in the solitary act of vengeance, but in the difficult, hopeful business of living.